Welcome to part 2 of the LGAP Standards Essentials training session. This part will focus on the language of LGAP and then the LGAP standard, which relates to animal welfare and management. Part 3 will focus on the management system standard and the chain of custody standard, followed by a review of what we covered throughout the whole session. In part 1, we looked at the LGAP standards and their design in more detail and how ESCAS and LGAP are constructed differently but also align. We will now go through the individual standards. The first standard under LGAP is LGAP 1000, which is the fundamentals and vocabulary. Language is important in ensuring shared expectations, even more so when words are required to be interpreted the same way across so many different countries and by so many different people. This is why we have a vocabulary standard. It is essentially a dictionary of terms for the other standards, so everyone involved in the program all speak the language of LGAP. Animark will work progressively to have documents translated. However, it's important to note that if there are any differences between the English version and the translated version, then the English version prevails. As we heard in the previous sessions, there are no auditable requirements in this standard. This section will give you an overview of what's included in LGAP 1000, but you can read through this standard, as well as the others, in your own time. The LGAP standards are based on 8 principles which relate to animal welfare and management, and LGAP 1000 introduces us to these principles, which are personnel and competency, infrastructure and equipment, identification of animals, animal health and welfare, management of animal movement, effective restraint, stunning and slaughter, management system approach with continual improvement, and traceability and control. Different standards address different principles, either individually or collectively. For example, the Animal Welfare and Management Standard addresses 6 of the 8 principles, while the Management System Standard addresses 1, of course being management system approach with continual improvement, and the Chain of Custody Standard addresses the traceability and control principle. Some other terms used in this document and in the other standards relate to the scope, which outlines who LGAP and the particular standard applies to, and the species. Importantly, it also details what is not within the scope of LGAP. For example, animals exported for breeding. There are a few other terms you'll encounter, including normative and informative. Normative means that it is an additional requirement found elsewhere, for example, in other documents or in an annex to a standard. These normative references need to be implemented and verified, and the requirements are auditable. That means an auditor will assess conformity. For example, the Animal Welfare and Management Standard includes a transport-related annex, which is normative. If an operator or facility is responsible for arranging transport, then they are responsible for ensuring the transport is undertaken in conformity with that annex. The auditor will audit that operator or facility against the requirements in that annex. If an operator or facility never arranges transport, then that annex is not applicable to them. If something is informative in a standard, it means it is for information or guidance only. It would not be audited against. In addition, there are a couple of other terms you will hear used differently during this presentation. The first is compliance, which generally relates to adherence to laws or regulations. For example, we talk about compliance with ESCAS. The other term you will hear is conformity, which is generally used in relation to fulfillment of a requirement in a standard, such as one of the LGAP standards. The wording of the requirements in the standards is based on ISO directives, which define the following language. Shall indicates a requirement, what is to be implemented and verified. For example, in the standard, there is a requirement which says lighting shall be conducive to animal movement and sufficient to perform individual animal inspection. This means that an auditor will consider the lighting and whether it helps or hinders animal movement and inspection. Should indicates a recommendation, which is a suggested possible choice or course of action, but is not verified. This is currently not used within the LGAP standards. May indicates a permission, that is a choice to act or not. For example, a requirement in the standards says supply chain partners may specify the format and language of documented information. This means an exporter may choose to ask for information from their supply chain partners in a particular format, or they may not. Can indicates a possibility or a capability in that something is able to be done or occur. Taking the requirement I mentioned earlier about transport, there is a note against a requirement which says transport operators can be owned and operated by the operator or facility. This means the operator or facility can own and operate the transport, or someone else can instead. I'll now just touch on a few other terms in the document which we will hear through the rest of the session. The first is critical control point, which is defined as an activity, step, point, process, or documented information defined by the operator or facility that is necessary to control in order to prevent a non-conformity and ensure ongoing fulfillment of the certification requirements. Examples of critical control points include the point of arrival, dispatch, and the point of slaughter. Documented information means information required to be controlled and maintained by a facility or operator and the medium on which it is contained. It can include records such as those relating to training and other documents such as standard operating procedures and work instructions. External traceability relates to documented information exchanged between operators and facilities to achieve traceability. Examples include tallies and monitoring data relating to animal identification and recording of movement, and associated business processes and procedures. Internal traceability means documented information of a proprietary nature that allows a facility or operator to achieve traceability within its own operation. Monitoring means observation of a specified critical control point, event, or situation in order to verify conformity with the LGAP certification requirements. Monitoring data is also defined as a recorded count or measurement of the results of monitoring. Top management means the person or group of people who directs and controls a facility or operator at the highest level. It may be that top management only directs and controls the organisation in relation to LGAP conformity. And then traceability relates to the ability to identify animals and record and track their movement. In addition to understanding the language of LGAP, it's also important to understand the structure of the standards. Each standard is structured based on sections which address different topics or principles. For example, Section 7 of the Animal Welfare and Management Standard addresses animal health. Each section is divided into subsections comprised of different requirements. Who these are applicable to is specified in the heading of each subsection. These conventions in terms of structure and headings are drawn from ISO directives. They start with general requirements, which apply to all parties the standard applies to. For example, in Section 7 of the Animal Welfare and Management Standard, there are general requirements for importer operators and all facilities. There are then additional requirements. For example, in Section 7, after the general requirements, there are additional requirements for feedlot, farm, and abattoir facilities. In some cases, the requirements may become more specific to a particular party. Again, for example, there are further additional requirements under the animal health section, specifically for feedlots and farms. There are also annexes or additional information at the back of the document, which, as we heard, can be normative or informative. As an example, if you were a feedlot, then you are a facility. So the general requirements would apply in this case, as would both the additional requirements and further additional requirements. An abattoir facility would have different requirements to the feedlot, and therefore different subsections would apply. In this case, it would be the general requirements and the additional requirements. And likewise, an importer operator would be different again in that only the general requirements would apply. So that section was to familiarise you with the language of LGAP and the structure of the standards. Our next section will look at LGAP 1001, which is the Animal Welfare and Management Standard. LGAP 1001 sets out requirements for the welfare and management of livestock. This standard is applicable to importer operators and feedlot, farm and abattoir facilities. The requirements are structured to address the principles of personnel, infrastructure and equipment, animal identification, animal health, livestock movement, and slaughter. Why do we have a standard for animal welfare and management? Livestock are an important source of protein around the world. However, there is increasing scrutiny on the treatment of livestock being raised for human food production, and this is only going to grow. There are international requirements, regulations, and expectations about how animals should be treated. ESCAS has taken expectations from the OIE and standardized them. LGAP builds on this standardization. Good animal welfare is defined as an animal which is healthy, comfortable, well-nourished and safe, able to express its typical normal behavior, and not suffering from pain, fear, and distress. The purpose of the LGAP Animal Welfare and Management Standard is to underpin this definition of good animal welfare by focusing on shelter, management and nutrition, disease prevention and veterinary or husbandry treatment, and competent, humane and considerate handling and slaughter. The LGAP standard turns the international expectations, codes and guidance in relation to what good animal welfare should look like, as well as the explicit requirements and inferred expectations under ESCAS, into a set of science-based, verifiable requirements. Before we go into the standard, let's have a look at what you may currently be doing under ESCAS and what you may need to consider when transitioning from ESCAS to LGAP. As we heard, the principles LGAP 1001 addresses relate to personnel, environment, infrastructure and equipment, animal identification, animal health, livestock movement, and slaughter and processing. If we consider each of these principles and what you may already be doing under ESCAS, then you can see that for personnel, ESCAS compliance may lead to fulfilling almost all of the requirements against this section. Depending on how you approach ESCAS compliance, you may already have full alignment with LGAP. For environment, infrastructure and equipment, you may be fulfilling about 80% of LGAP requirements as a result of ESCAS. The differences rest in some of the requirements which help underpin traceability. So you could actually be fulfilling all of the requirements under LGAP, given traceability is a requirement under ESCAS, and traceability requires some form of infrastructure or equipment. Animal identification may sound new, but remember we've heard this enables traceability. So again, you may be fulfilling about 65% of these requirements, if not significantly more. There are some more specific requirements here depending on the type of operation you run. Animal health is an interesting one, as it may sound like you could be doing 100% of this under ESCAS. However, LGAP introduces a handful of new requirements in relation to ongoing monitoring of animal health. Overall, however, you may be fulfilling 75% of the LGAP requirements, depending on how you have implemented ESCAS requirements in your operation. The monitoring requirements in LGAP are designed to address the issues we heard about earlier in terms of what happens to ensure conformity during the inter-audit gap. We do know these monitoring requirements are good practices for businesses and managing risk. So many of you may already be doing these activities and have greater alignment. Livestock movement is another principle which relates to enabling traceability. So about 65% of the requirements may be fulfilled based on what you could be doing under ESCAS to demonstrate compliance with the traceability principle. It could even be higher depending on your approach. Slaughter and processing will have a lot of overlap between ESCAS and LGAP, with some additional requirements in relation to monitoring appearing in this section also. Again, if you are already doing these activities under ESCAS, then it's more likely you'll be able to demonstrate conformity with all of these requirements. So as you can see, for some operators or facilities, complying with ESCAS, there is quite a lot of alignment, and for some, this may even be higher. This isn't to say that where there are gaps, that this is because of new requirements. It's more to do with some of these aspects either not being specified in ESCAS but are actually inferred, or they require greater clarity to avoid ambiguity, particularly during the audit process. Don't forget that LGAP was not designed to replicate ESCAS, but rather overcome some of the challenges a regulatory framework has when it is required to operate across sovereign borders. So some of what you may not be familiar with under LGAP is there to strengthen arrangements under ESCAS and address these challenges. Let's have a look at each of the principles addressed in this standard and what needs to be achieved. The first principle we heard about relates to personnel and competency, in that there are adequate numbers of people available who are competent for the tasks that need to be performed. Competency means personnel need to have the necessary knowledge and skills for the task they perform. Let's have a look at the requirements in this section. There are 3 requirements relating to personnel. To address these requirements, it's probably best if you consider them as questions. What needs to be done in order to fulfill the LGAP certification requirements? Where do these activities need to be undertaken? And when should they occur? For example, what needs to be done in relation to loading and unloading under LGAP? Where does that happen? And when does it happen? How many people are required to do what needs to be done? For example, how many people do you need to assist with loading and unloading to ensure it is effective and done in accordance with the LGAP standards? Who is responsible for what and where are they? For example, what different responsibilities does each person involved with loading and unloading have? And where are the different people located? Are they on site at the loading ramp or in a yard? Or are they elsewhere overseeing the whole operation? What skills and knowledge or competencies do they require in order to do their job? For example, does the person unloading the truck require different skills and knowledge to the person who is responsible for overseeing the process? Importantly, when addressing these questions, you also need to think about how you demonstrate the answers to an auditor or the evidence you need to demonstrate conformity with the requirements. If we take, for example, what skills and knowledge people may require if they are responsible for loading or unloading livestock from transport, then there is an annex in the standard which defines the types of competencies different roles would require. You would need to keep evidence that your personnel have these competencies. This could be through training records, work instructions, or other items. The auditor will also assess practices on the day to determine if personnel are competent in consideration of the annex. The next principle this standard addresses relates to environment, infrastructure, and equipment, in that infrastructure and equipment are designed, constructed, and maintained to ensure that they are appropriate for the livestock being handled or the purpose they fulfill, and do not cause harm. There are 13 requirements which relate to this principle, but remember, not all of these apply to all operators or facilities. Some relate to feedlot facilities and some to abattoir facilities. Again, if we consider the requirements as questions, then the types of questions you'll need to consider relate to what infrastructure and equipment is required. Is it available where and when needed? Is it designed to ensure good animal welfare outcomes? And is it in good repair and maintained? Does everyone know how to use it properly? Again, consider how you will demonstrate you are meeting the outcomes of these requirements to an auditor. Generally, for aspects like infrastructure and equipment, the auditor will inspect these items and consider if they are fit for purpose. They will also look for things like work instructions and manufacturer's instructions, and then interview personnel to ensure they understand how they should be used. They will also observe the infrastructure and equipment being used to ensure it is being done so according to the instructions and that the people using the items are competent in their use. The next principle relates to animal identification, in that there is a system in place to ensure all animals on site are identified to enable traceability throughout the supply chain. As we heard before, this may sound new, but the requirements are based on activities which need to be undertaken in order to enable traceability of livestock through the supply chain, which is an ESCAS requirement. Internal traceability, which we heard is defined earlier, underpins traceability. Internal traceability requires animals to be identified and movements to be recorded within a site. So this principle addresses the animal identification requirements. The requirements under this section relate to ensuring animals remain identified in order to underpin traceability and address a range of considerations. Again, we can consider the 12 requirements in this section as questions which you need to answer. What kind of identification can be used? Various forms of identification are permitted through an annex to the standard, including those you would currently be using under ESCAS. For example, most of you will be familiar with an individual animal identification, which can be used such as the Australian NLIS RFID ear tags, or another sort of individual electronic tag, such as a UHF or GPS tag, or even a visual management tag. You may also be familiar with mob-based identification methods used for sheep and goats, which are also permitted under LGAP. The next question is, when should animals be checked to make sure they are identified correctly? This focuses on making sure the animals remain identified as they move in and out of the facility and while they remain in the facility. This means animals need to be checked for the type of identification they're supposed to have. Other requirements in this section can be considered administrative in that they relate to the questions: what should be done if identification is missing? What information needs to be shared? These focus on identifying issues if animals are checked and identification is missing, for example, if they lose an ear tag, and helping information to be exchanged between supply chain partners so that traceability through the chain can be maintained. The next principle relates to animal health, in that effective management practices are in place to reduce livestock morbidity, mortality, and other risks to animal health and welfare. A large part of this will be similar to what you are already doing under ESCAS. Some of the key differences relate to ensuring any animal treatments necessary, say for example if an animal gets sick, are administered by competent personnel in accordance with any label or veterinary directions, which can simply be fact sheets or videos. This is good practice, and facilities that may need to treat animals would generally already be doing this. So in many cases, this is about formalising existing practices. This section covers a range of subjects that contribute to the overall welfare of an animal, but with a particular focus on animal health aspects. The requirements in this section provide clarity around what poor animal health looks like. For example, leg health, body condition, respiration, and altered demeanour. It also provides requirements about when and how to check animals for these indicators of poor animal health, and keeping documented information or records to support the outcomes of these inspections. In addition, there are requirements which look at how animals should be handled, which provides greater clarity around calm and effective handling and ensuring harm, distress, and injury is avoided. This includes references to Annex H, which defines unacceptable practices and procedures, which are always considered critical non-conformities. The requirements in this section also look at what actions need to be taken if issues occur. This includes monitoring animal handling at critical control points to ensure targets related to the occurrence of slips, falls, and for cattle vocalization are not exceeded. You will be familiar with these targets because they exist under ESCAS. However, there is a further requirement in this section that if monitoring shows that these targets are exceeded, then action needs to be taken to rectify the reason for the targets being exceeded. Demonstration of conformity with the requirements in this subsection will be based on a combination of documented information or record keeping and observation of practices. The next principle relates to livestock movement, in that effective management practices are in place to ensure movements of animals in and out of a site, as well as within a site, are recorded to enable traceability throughout the supply chain. Remember, this principle is designed to enable traceability through the supply chain, which is a requirement of ESCAS. The 9 requirements under this section specifies what needs to occur in order to ensure internal traceability. That is, the facility knows where the animals are while they are on site, where they have come from, and where they have gone. For most facilities, a lot of this information will already be kept either in paper form or electronically. To work out what you may need to do to demonstrate conformity, it's important to consider what information you are currently keeping for livestock arriving and leaving the site, and what practices you are undertaking to confirm the receipt and consignment of the animals. Then compare this information to the requirements in this standard and identify if anything may be missing. For example, you may be recording the site from which the animals were dispatched, but at this time you wouldn't be recording their LGAP certification number. This is something which will need to be provided between upstream and downstream trading partners to enable livestock to be moved between certified facilities. An individual operator or facility can find out their own certification number using the Animark IT conformance system and provide this to their trading partners. During an audit, the auditor will want to see records which show this information. The LGAP standards don't specify if this should be in written form or electronic form. It is up to each facility to determine the best record-keeping system for their own operation. The final principle in this standard is based on the expectation that restraint, stunning, and slaughter processes are carried out in a considerate and effective manner. Overall, the requirements which support this principle should be familiar with everyone complying with ESCAS. You need to consider your current practices and determine which methods of restraint and stunning are used. You can review the restraint methods permitted under LGAP in Annex E, and for facilities which use stunning, the permitted stunning methods are outlined in Annex F. These should match what you are familiar with under ESCAS. You then need to review how slaughter is performed. So look at your current standard operating procedures and work instructions and compare these to the requirements under LGAP for slaughter. Then consider how you are currently assessing effective stunning, unconsciousness, and death. There are a number of annexes which provide indicators in these areas which you'll need to refer to. Finally, there are also a number of targets which need to be monitored. Consideration should be given to what action needs to be taken in the event that these targets are not met. For example, if stunning is not effective. Auditing in relation to the requirements in this section would involve a number of aspects, such as the auditor inspecting restraint, stunning, and slaughter equipment, reviewing work instructions, discussing procedures with personnel, and observing actual practices. That concludes part 2 of the LGAP Standards Essentials training. Please access part 3, which will focus on the Management System Standard and the Chain of Custody Standard, followed by a review of what we have covered throughout the whole session. You can access part 3 from the Anamark website by visiting www.anamark.com.au.